Imagine you're a farmer in 13th century China. You've lived your entire life under a system where tax collectors can show up at any time demanding whatever they want, where corrupt officials take bribes to reduce some people's taxes while crushing others, where you never know how much you'll owe or when it will be demanded, where the system is so unpredictable and arbitrary that you can't plan, can't save, can't invest in improving your farm because any surplus will just be confiscated. And then the Mongols invade, and everyone expects things to get worse because the Mongols have a reputation as savage destroyers. But something strange happens. A new tax system is implemented, and suddenly you know exactly how much tax you owe. It's a flat percentage of your production, the same for everyone. No exceptions, no bribes, no arbitrary demands, and tax collectors come at predictable times. They assess your harvest fairly. They take exactly what's owed and not a single grain more. And if any tax collector tries to take extra or demands bribes, they're executed. And this seems almost miraculous. You're living under foreign conquerors, but the tax system is more fair, more predictable, and more rational than anything you experienced under native Chinese rule. And this isn't just about taxes. This is about how Genghis Khan and his successors built the largest land empire in human history, not just through military conquest, but through administrative genius. And at the heart of that administrative system was a tax policy that was revolutionary in its simplicity, fairness, and effectiveness. And understanding how this tax system worked, why it was so successful, and what lessons it teaches us about governance and economics is crucial to understanding how a group of nomadic warriors conquered and governed territory from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Middle East, creating an empire that functioned, that generated enormous revenue, and that in many ways was better governed than the supposedly more civilized empires it conquered. Let's start with Genghis Khan himself and how he thought about governance and taxation, because his background is crucial to understanding his policies. Genghis Khan was born as Temujin around 1162 into a world of constant tribal warfare, shifting alliances, and brutal survival. He experienced poverty, betrayal, and near-death situations multiple times in his youth. And when he finally unified the Mongol tribes and was proclaimed Genghis Khan in 1206, he had a very clear understanding of what made societies function or fail. He understood that loyalty was built through meritocracy, fairness, and predictability. He understood that arbitrary rule and corruption destroyed social cohesion. And he understood that if you wanted to govern a vast empire, you needed systems that worked without requiring his personal intervention at every level. So from the very beginning, even before the great conquests, Genghis Khan was implementing administrative systems based on rational organization, rather than traditional tribal customs, and taxation was central to this. The basic principle of Mongol taxation was revolutionary in its simplicity, a flat tax rate applied universally, typically around 10% of production for settled agricultural populations, with some variations depending on circumstances, but the key was universality and predictability. Everyone paid the same rate. There were no exemptions for nobles, no special privileges for the wealthy, no possibilities for bribing your way to lower taxes, and the rate was fixed and predictable. So, farmers knew that they'd owe 10% of their harvest, herders knew they'd owe 10% of their livestock increase, and merchants knew they'd owe 10% of their trade profits. And this predictability was enormously valuable because it allowed people to plan, to invest, to work toward improving their situation knowing that they'd keep 90% of any gains they made. And this contrasted sharply with most medieval tax systems where rates were arbitrary, collection was unpredictable, and corruption was rampant. But the genius of the Mongol system wasn't just the flat rate. It was the enforcement mechanisms that made the system work in practice. Because declaring a fair tax system is easy, actually implementing it across a vast empire with diverse cultures, languages, and economic systems is extraordinarily difficult. And this is where Mongol administrative innovation becomes apparent. First, Genghis Khan conducted systematic censuses of conquered populations. These weren't just rough estimates, they were detailed surveys that recorded every household, every adult male, every piece of land, every source of production, and these censuses provided the data needed to assess taxes fairly and to detect fraud. Second, tax collection was professionalized and regularized. Tax collectors were appointed by the central government. They were rotated regularly to prevent them from developing local ties that might lead to corruption, and they were held to strict accountability if a tax collector was caught taking bribes, stealing from the treasury, or oppressing populations beyond the legal tax rate. The punishment was death, no exceptions, no matter how well-connected you were, and this created strong incentives for honest administration. Third, the Mongols established a separation between military and civilian administration. Military commanders conquered territory, but civilian administrators governed it. And this separation prevented the kind of military extraction and abuse that was common in many empires where military forces would simply loot and plunder conquered populations. Instead, Mongol military forces were supplied through the tax system. They received regular pay and provisions rather than living off plunder, and this made Mongol occupation much less oppressive than it might have been. Conquered populations paid taxes, but they weren't subject to constant military predation, and this made Mongol rule more acceptable and stable. Fourth, the Mongols implemented a sophisticated system of record-keeping and reporting. Regional officials had to submit regular reports to the capital detailing tax collection, expenditures, population changes, and economic conditions, and these reports were audited by the central administration, creating accountability and making it difficult for corruption to remain hidden. And all of this required a level of administrative sophistication that was remarkable for a nomadic people who had no tradition of bureaucratic governance just decades earlier. The economic impact of this tax system was transformative because predictable and relatively low taxation encourages economic activity. When farmers know they'll keep 90% of any increase in production, they have incentive to work harder, to improve their techniques, to invest in better tools and irrigation. When merchants know they'll pay a fixed percentage on trade, they have incentive to increase trade volume. When craftsmen know their taxes are predictable, they can plan their businesses and invest in expansion. So the Mongol tax system, while extracting resources for the empire, also stimulated economic growth in conquered territories. And this created a virtuous cycle where economic growth increased tax revenues, which funded better administration and infrastructure, which further supported economic growth, and the Mongols understood this relationship. They weren't just extracting wealth, they were creating conditions for wealth generation, because a prosperous population could pay more taxes than an impoverished one, and sustaining prosperity was more valuable long-term than short-term maximum extraction. Let's look at specific examples of how this worked in different parts of the empire, because the Mongols controlled vastly different economic systems, and they adapted their tax policies while maintaining core principles. In China, which had a sophisticated agricultural economy and existing bureaucratic systems, the Mongols implemented their flat tax through Chinese administrators who understood local conditions. They conducted detailed land surveys to assess agricultural productivity. They established regular tax collection schedules tied to harvest times, and they abolished many of the arbitrary fees and corvée labor requirements that had burdened Chinese peasants under previous dynasties. And initially, there was resistance from Chinese elites who had benefited from the old system's corruption and exemptions. But the broader population often found Mongol taxation more fair and less burdensome than what they'd experienced before in Persia and the Middle East, which had different agricultural systems and urban commercial economies. The Mongols adapted their approach. They maintained the basic flat rate principle but worked through existing Islamic administrative structures, using local officials who understood Persian and Arabic taxation traditions. And they were particularly careful with Islamic religious endowments and institutions, generally respecting their traditional privileges while bringing them into a regularized system. In Russia and Eastern Europe, where the economy was less developed and more rural, the Mongols implemented a simpler version of their system, focusing on tribute payments from local princes who were responsible for collecting from their populations. As long as tribute was paid reliably, local rulers had considerable autonomy. And this system of indirect rule was economically efficient because it used existing power structures rather than building entirely new administration. The Mongol tax system also had important features beyond just collection rates. One crucial element was tax exemptions for specific groups that served important functions. Religious institutions of all types, Buddhist monasteries, Christian churches, Muslim mosques, were generally exempt from taxation. And this wasn't just religious tolerance. though the Mongols were genuinely religiously tolerant. It was also strategic. Religious institutions provided social services, education, and moral authority that supported social stability, and exempting them from taxes was cheaper than having the government provide these services directly. Similarly, scholars, doctors, and skilled craftsmen were often granted tax exemptions or reductions because their skills were valuable to society, and this created incentives for education and skill development. Another important feature was that taxation was based on actual production rather than fixed payments. So in bad years when harvests failed, tax obligations decreased proportionally. This was crucial for maintaining political stability because it meant populations weren't pushed into starvation by inflexible tax demands. And it also made economic sense because dead taxpayers don't pay taxes, so maintaining population health and stability, even if it meant lower revenues in bad years, was rational long-term policy. The Mongol approach to merchant taxation deserves special attention because it was particularly innovative and important for empire building. Merchants paid a flat percentage on the value of goods traded, typically around 10%, but they received something extraordinary in return: guaranteed safe passage across the entire Mongol Empire. The yam system of way stations provided horses, food, and accommodations. Mongol law ruthlessly punished anyone who robbed or cheated merchants, and caravans traveling with Mongol protection were essentially guaranteed to reach their destinations safely. And this transformed long-distance trade. Before the Mongols, traveling from China to Europe meant passing through dozens of different territories, each with different rules, different currencies, different officials demanding bribes and fees, and enormous risk of banditry. Under Mongol rule, you paid one tax to one authority and could travel from one end of Asia to the other with safety and predictability. And this caused trade volumes to explode, which meant more tax revenue from the flat percentage on trade. So the Mongols' merchant taxation wasn't just extraction, it was providing valuable services that justified the tax and that stimulated the economic activity being taxed. The integration of monetary and taxation policy was also sophisticated. The Mongols understood that taxation and currency were related. They implemented paper money systems in China and tried to extend them across the empire. They standardized weights and measures to make trade and tax assessment easier, and they regulated currency exchange to prevent manipulation and fraud. And all of this created a more efficient economic system where transactions costs were lower, trade was easier, and economic activity was stimulated, which ultimately benefited the empire through increased tax revenues. So Mongol economic policy wasn't just about taking resources, it was about creating systems that enabled economic activity and growth. Now let's talk about what made this system sustainable. Because many tax systems work initially, but break down over time due to corruption, evasion, or economic decline. But the Mongol system, at least during the empire's peak in the 13th and early 14th centuries, remained remarkably effective, and this sustainability was built on several factors. First was meritocracy in administration. Officials were appointed based on ability rather than birth or connections, and this created a class of professional administrators with incentives to maintain the system's integrity because their careers depended on performance. Second was the credible threat of harsh punishment for corruption. The Mongols' reputation for brutality, which was terrifying in warfare, also served to deter official malfeasance. Everyone knew that corruption would be met with execution, and this was an empty threat. Examples of corrupt officials being executed were frequent enough to maintain deterrence. Third was the regular rotation of officials, preventing them from developing the local networks that enable sustained corruption. Fourth was the oversight and audit systems that made concealing corruption difficult. And fifth was the relative simplicity of the tax system. A flat rate is much harder to manipulate than a complex system with multiple rates, exemptions, and special cases. So the system's design made honest administration easier and corrupt administration harder. The comparison to other medieval tax systems makes the Mongol achievement more apparent, because most medieval states had tax systems that were incredibly complex, arbitrary, and corrupt. In medieval Europe, tax rates varied by region, by social class, by specific privileges and exemptions. Nobles often paid no taxes, clergy had special arrangements, and common people bore the heaviest burden. But even among commoners, rates were inconsistent and negotiable, and tax collection was often farmed. out to private contractors who had incentive to maximize extraction, leading to oppression and resentment. Similarly, in China before the Mongols, the tax system was complex with multiple types of taxes, labor obligations, and fees, and corruption was rampant with officials taking bribes and skimming revenues. So when the Mongols came in with their flat rate, universal application, and harsh anti-corruption enforcement, it was actually an improvement in many areas, which helps explain why Mongol rule, despite being foreign conquest, was sometimes more stable and less resented than native rule had been. But the Mongol tax system had limitations and eventually declined, because no system is perfect and circumstances change. One limitation was that the system worked best for conquest and expansion. When the empire was growing, the combination of plunder from new conquests and taxes from newly incorporated territories provided enormous revenues. But when expansion stopped, as it inevitably did because the Mongols reached the limits of territory they could effectively conquer and control, revenues from conquest ceased, and the empire became entirely dependent on taxation. And this required even more efficient administration and economic growth to maintain revenues, which was challenging. Another limitation was succession crises. Genghis Khan's system worked partly because of his personal authority and the loyalty he commanded, but after his death, the empire eventually fragmented into separate khanates that often fought each other, and this fragmentation undermined the unified administration that made the tax system effective. When different parts of the empire were at war, trade routes were disrupted, administration became less efficient, and the economic benefits of unified Mongol rule declined. The tax system also faced challenges from the populations it governed, particularly in regions like China where there were deeply rooted alternative models of governance. Chinese elites never fully accepted Mongol rule and worked to undermine it, advocating for restoration of traditional Chinese systems that gave them more privileges and opportunities for corruption. And over time, as the Mongol rulers became more Sinicized, more influenced by Chinese culture and traditions, they gradually moved away from the pure Mongol system towards something more like traditional Chinese administration. And this brought back many of the problems that the Mongol system had solved, increasing corruption, reducing fairness, and weakening the economic foundations of rule. So the very success of Mongol governance, which brought stability and prosperity, created conditions where conquered elites could push back against Mongol systems and restore traditional arrangements that benefited them. Despite these limitations and eventual decline, the Mongol tax system left important legacies. The principle of universal taxation without exemptions for privileged classes influenced later tax reforms in many regions. The idea that fair and predictable taxation could be more effective than maximum extraction influenced administrative thinking. And the demonstration that nomadic conquerors could govern vast, diverse empires through rational systems rather than just military force challenged assumptions about civilization and governance. And in specific regions, Mongol administrative practices influenced later states. The Ming dynasty in China, which overthrew Mongol rule, actually adopted some Mongol administrative techniques, and various Central Asian and Middle Eastern states continued using systems influenced by Mongol practices long after the empire fragmented. The lessons from Genghis Khan's tax system remain relevant to modern governance and economic policy. First, simplicity in taxation has enormous advantages. Complex tax codes with multiple rates, exemptions, and special provisions create opportunities for evasion, manipulation, and corruption, while simple flat rates are more transparent and easier to enforce fairly. Second, universality matters. When everyone pays the same rate with no exemptions for privileged groups, it creates perceptions of fairness that support political legitimacy. Third, predictability is valuable. When people know what they'll owe and when it will be collected, they can plan and invest, which supports economic growth. Fourth, enforcement of rules, particularly anti-corruption measures, requires credible commitment. The Mongols' willingness to execute corrupt officials, regardless of rank or connections, made their system credible in ways that systems with weak enforcement never achieve. Fifth, taxation should be based on actual economic capacity. The Mongol practice of adjusting taxes based on actual harvest yields rather than fixed payments prevented the system from pushing populations into crisis during bad years. And sixth, providing value in exchange for taxes. like the Mongols did with safe trade routes and fair administration, makes taxation more acceptable and can actually stimulate the economic activity being taxed. There's also something profound about the fact that Genghis Khan, who was illiterate for most of his life and came from a nomadic culture with no tradition of bureaucratic governance, created a tax system that was in many ways more rational and effective than those of much more ancient and supposedly civilized empires. This challenges assumptions about where good governance comes from and reminds us that administrative effectiveness isn't about cultural sophistication or ancient traditions, but about rational design, clear principles, and consistent enforcement. Genghis Khan approached governance as a practical problem to be solved. He observed what worked and what didn't. He learned from conquered people's experiences, and he implemented systems based on effectiveness rather than tradition. And this pragmatic, results-oriented approach produced innovations that more tradition-bound societies couldn't achieve because they were locked into existing systems and privileges. The psychological and social impact of fair taxation shouldn't be underestimated either, because when people believe the system is fair, when they see that rules apply equally to everyone, when they know that hard work will benefit them rather than just enriching corrupt officials, it changes their relationship to the state. They're more willing to comply with rules, more likely to contribute to public goods, more invested in the system's stability, and this creates a foundation for effective governance that military force alone can never provide. The Mongols understood this instinctively. They knew that governing conquered populations required not just fear, but also legitimacy, and fair taxation was a crucial source of that legitimacy. It showed that Mongol rule, while foreign and sometimes brutal, operated according to principles rather than arbitrary whim. And this made Mongol administration acceptable to many conquered peoples who had experienced worse under native rulers. Looking at the Mongol tax system also reveals interesting insights about the relationship between state capacity and economic development. Because effective taxation requires administrative capacity, you need to conduct censuses, maintain records, train officials, establish communication networks, and enforce rules. And building this capacity requires investment. But once you have it, it enables not just taxation, but all sorts of other government functions that support development. The same administrative systems that enabled Mongol taxation also enabled infrastructure projects, maintenance of trade routes, enforcement of laws, and provision of public goods. So investing in state capacity has returns that extend far beyond just collecting taxes. And this is a lesson that developing countries today often struggle with, because building effective administration is expensive and takes time. But without it, neither taxation nor economic development can reach their potential. The Mongol case also shows that cultural and religious tolerance can have economic benefits. By exempting religious institutions and allowing diverse populations to maintain their traditions and practices, the Mongols reduced resistance to their rule and created conditions where diverse talents and perspectives could contribute to the empire's economy. Merchants from different backgrounds could trade freely. Scholars from different traditions could exchange ideas, and artisans from various cultures could practice their crafts. And this diversity was economically productive, generating innovation, trade, and growth that benefited the empire. So tolerance wasn't just moral, it was economically rational. And this contrasts with empires that tried to impose religious or cultural uniformity, which often faced resistance that was expensive to suppress and that reduced economic productivity. In the end, Genghis Khan's tax system built an empire not just by extracting resources, but by creating conditions for economic activity and growth, by establishing fairness and predictability that allowed people to plan and invest, by providing services like safe trade routes that made commerce possible, and by implementing administrative systems that were efficient and relatively uncorrupt. And this shows that taxation isn't just about taking from populations, it's about creating relationships between states and societies, about providing value in exchange for resources, and about establishing systems that enable rather than suppress economic activity. And the fact that these principles were understood and implemented by a nomadic conqueror in the 13th century, and that in some ways his system was more effective than many modern tax systems with all their complexity and supposed sophistication, should make us think carefully about what makes taxation effective and fair, and about how we might learn from historical examples, even unlikely ones, to improve contemporary governance and economic policy. Because the basic insight that Genghis Khan understood, that fair, predictable, universal taxation enforced by credible commitment to punishing corruption creates the conditions for both political legitimacy and economic prosperity, remains as true today as it was 800 years ago. And perhaps the greatest testament to Genghis Khan's tax system is that it enabled a nomadic people, with no tradition of governing settled populations, to build and maintain the largest contiguous land empire in human history, not just through military conquest, which was impressive enough, but through creating administrative systems that actually worked, that governed diverse populations across vast distances, and that in many cases provided better governance than the supposedly more civilized empires they replaced. And that's the ultimate lesson of how Genghis Khan's tax system built an empire. That good governance is based on rational principles consistently applied, not on cultural sophistication or ancient traditions. And that sometimes the greatest innovations come from unlikely sources who approach problems with fresh perspectives unencumbered by the weight of tradition and privilege.